Dream Team? It's your boy Neal back with another reaction video, guys. Here we are with how Australia keeps losing wars to animals. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel, ring the notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so it gets suggested, and let's find out what's going on.
Australia is currently in the midst of a very serious war that's been going on for over a century against an enemy that is likely to win. This enemy isn't another country though, or anything along those lines. Instead, it's flightless birds, toads and rabbits, which is rather curious on multiple levels, as neither the rabbits nor the toads are native to this country, and the emus are just birds that can't fly. So how is this possible? Why is Australia in a war against something that shouldn't even be there? And why on earth has it been going on for 150 years?
Oh my lord.
Well, it all started with the flightless bird, the emu. And this is where things start to get interesting. It's the 1930s, and Australia, like the rest of the world, was suffering from the Great Depression. Wheat prices were falling, and the Australian government had to do something to increase food production in order to feed the population. So they went to the farmers and tried to incentivize them to increase production through promises of subsidies. It worked, and wheat production increased dramatically. However, the government fell through and never provided any assistance to the farmers, and to make matters worse, the breeding season for emus had just ended, which was a serious problem because emus migrate after the breeding season, and they were therefore headed straight towards Western Australia in incredible numbers. And with a flock of up to 20,000 emus comes the search for just as much food. Luckily for them though, the farmers had a bunch of wheat lying around that they weren't selling to the Australian government in protest for not receiving the subsidies they were promised. So the omnivorous emus began destroying and devouring huge quantities of the farmers' crops. The emu war had begun, and Australia was fighting against an invasive species they had to get rid of to survive. So they put together what they saw as the most effective strategy that would make them the victors of this war. So what is the most effective way to combat an invasive species? Well, after some discussion, the Australian government came to the perfect solution: military force. Which was the prelude to the government agreeing to deploy 2 soldiers with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition
under the command of an army major.
They wanted 2 soldiers to take out over 20,000 emus. Oh, that's funny. I've heard this the emu war story on like Drunk History by Brienne Worth. Was it Drunk History? It was some kind of history by Brienne Worth. Absolutely incredible video. But 2 soldiers versus thousands and thousands of emus
to eradicate the emus. Wait, 20,000 emus versus 3 soldiers with only 10,000 rounds of ammunition? That seems about right. And so the trio was sent off to help the farmers, and they were allowed to assist them under the sole condition the farmers paid for food, accommodation and ammunition. So in October, the soldiers were prepared to begin the extermination of the emus. 3 soldiers, 10,000 bullets against 20,000 emus. It was going to be a walk in the park. Or so they thought, because before the operation had even started, they encountered an issue. And no, subtraction hadn't been invented back then, so the lack of ammunition and soldiers weren't the problem here. Instead, heavy rain had caused the emus to scatter over the plains, making them difficult targets to hit with the machine guns. So the attack was postponed to the following month. And on the 2nd of November, the act finally began. The soldiers had traveled to the small town of Campion after news broke that 50 emus had been sighted there. But since the emus were out of range, locals attempted to herd the birds into an ambush. But this instead led the birds to scatter in all directions. Yet still, the soldiers tried to shoot them anyway. But all in all, only about a dozen of the feathered freaks were killed that day. 12 down, 19,988 to go. And while the first day couldn't be considered a success, the soldiers were destined to succeed just a couple of days later. The Major had managed to set up an ambush against more than 1,000 emus that were headed straight towards them. With the machine gun ready, all was coming together. The gunners took aim, and when the birds entered their proximity, they started firing. Unfortunately for the bloodthirsty soldiers though, they once again only managed to kill around a dozen of the emus before their machine gun jammed, and before the gun was fixed, the birds were long gone. Another opportunity had gone down the drain.
Oh,
with only 20
Lord,
or so
bro.
dead emus on their resume, the mayor and his team decided to travel to the south of Campion to see if they had better luck there. The third time's a charm, right? I mean, this
No.
decision did make sense, as the
No.
emus were supposedly tamer around these corners of the country. So if there were a place they could succeed, it would be here. But unfortunately, they couldn't rack up the kills they were hoping for. However, they did make an interesting discovery. The flocks of emus seemed to have a leader who would be on the lookout for potential threats, while the others reveled in the crops of the Australian farmers. So every time the emu pack leader noticed the soldiers, they would alert the entire flock, who would then scatter in all directions. Which, to be fair, is pretty clever. But the mayor was growing tired of this game of cat and mouse between his trio and the surprisingly clever and agile flock of flightless birds. So he conducted a new plan. If the birds wouldn't come to him, he would come to the birds. Seems reasonable, and so the decision was made to mount one of the Lewis machine guns to the bed of a truck so they would be able to shoot the emus on the go. Brilliant idea, right? Well, you can probably see where this could go wrong.
No, terrible idea.
And go wrong it did.
Of
While
course it
2,500 rounds of ammunition had been fired within a week, official records indicate that the number of dead emus only amassed to 300. The army mayor in charge of the soldiers even compared the invulnerability of the birds to tanks. Oh yeah, and one of the fleeing emus got caught in the steering wheel of the truck, causing it to crash into a nearby fence. So the operation was deemed a complete and utter failure and was put on hold for a while, only to be resumed for a few weeks where they were actually slightly more successful. All in all though, the 3 soldiers killed just under 1,000 emus with the 10,000 bullets, meaning an impressive 10% accuracy had been achieved. Which actually, believe it or not, led a politician to ask whether any medals would be given to the brave participants of the Emu War. To which a Western Australian politician replied that if any medals were to be given, they would go to the emus. We have won every round thus far. Pretty funny, but he did have a point. But now what? The emus had to be dealt with somehow, and nothing had worked thus far. So the Australian government did something crazy. They took inspiration from the Americans and began supplying the local farmers with ammunition and guns, and rewarded bounties for dead emus, which proved very successful, and in 1934, 57,000 emus were killed in just 6 months.
That sounds a lot better. A lot better strategy. A lot better strategy than 3 men trying to kill all those emus. Let's just freaking arm all the farmers who these emus are destroying their crops. Let's arm them, and when the emus come, they kill them. Wow. And you giving them a bounty too? Oh yeah. Much better strategy.
Many thousands of emus have also been killed by locals since then, and the emu population in Australia is now estimated to be at a stable 600,000 to 700,000.
Oh
so
my
yeah,
God.
after multiple attempts, Australia did manage to overcome and win their first war against animals. Granted, it did take a few tries and multiple decades, but they eventually came out on top. Although I guess the Australian farmers must have been in need of a new challenge, as it didn't take long before they introduced a pest to the Australian wildlife. You see, in 1935, cane beetles were devouring large fields of sugarcane in the state of Queensland, which was obviously harming the output of the local farmers significantly. So in a desperate attempt to save their remaining crops, the Aussie farmers looked towards South America, where cane toads were being used to eat the worms and grubs that were causing trouble in those regions. And to the Aussies, these toads seemed like a super effective tool against the issue at hand. Therefore, it was decided that 102 of these cane toads would be imported into Australia and set free. But quickly after setting the toads free, the farmers realized something. the cane beetles sat at the top of the sugar canes, and the cane toads sat at the bottom.
Australia, I love y'all. I love y'all.
Which is a result of the toads not being very proficient jumpers or climbers, something the farmers forgot to check before they set them free, ultimately making the toads useless. But there was another thing the farmers had failed to consider: the extreme sex drive of these toads. As in, they'll try to mate with anything. Apparently, scientists have found them attempting to mate with rocks, clumps of dirt, and human legs. But another rather important detail is the fact that they mate all year round, and can lay up to 30,000 eggs at a time. But worst of all, these four-legged monsters have no natural enemies in Australia, since they aren't native to this region, and due to the fact they possess toxic glands on their back, which is poisonous to virtually all Australian wildlife. So they were just left to reproduce without any hindrance. And reproduce they did, as the 102 cane toads from 1935 have since increased to an estimated 200 million.
Oh my god!
The cane toads have migrated from small coastal parts of Queensland, where they were first released, into central and north Queensland, thousands of miles away. They've even crossed into the states of New South Wales and Northern Territory. And since they can travel up to 60 kilometers or 37 miles per year, no corner of the country is safe from invasion. With no efficient way of eradicating large quantities of these toads, they might be here to stay. The only thing that has ever worked was pesticides, which were used on them for a short period of time, with great results actually. However, this method was banned when the chemicals turned out to cause cancer in humans. So yeah, it's pretty much the perfect invasive species, and with no signs of slowing its presence in the country, and with the cane toads invading more land for each day they roam, it's safe to say that this victory goes to the toads. It's now 1-0. But unfortunately for Australia, we aren't done, as there's one last animal I need to tell you about. An animal that is so unwanted in Australia that 3 fences totaling 3,256 kilometers have been built in order to contain it. It spans from north to south and east to west of the huge state of Western Australia, and it has one purpose: to keep this animal out. So what animal could this possibly be? Kangaroos? Dingoes? Well, not quite. It's rabbits. That, once again, isn't native to Australia. Do you see a pattern here? Well, unlike the cane toads, the rabbits weren't actually released to eat bugs. Instead, it was introduced for a much dumber reason. I know, it's hard to believe, but hear me out. The British settlers became quite bored after a while, and therefore they wanted to hunt rabbits, like they did back home. After all, how much harm could a handful of cute rabbits really do? So the...
I absolutely love this video, guys. I'm enjoying this so much.
Brits decided to import 24 of them into the state of Victoria and began hunting away. But as it turned out, the Brits weren't that good at hunting, and therefore didn't end up killing all of them. And when you don't kill all of them, well, the rabbits start doing what rabbits do best: reproduce. Unfortunately though, it turns out the conditions for reproducing were optimal in Australia, as a result of 2 crucial factors. First is the mild winters that meant the rabbits could reproduce all year round, and secondly the place at which the rabbits had been released, as this place happened to be the biggest agricultural region of the country, providing an abundance of food that fueled their extreme growth. Furthermore, the 24 imported rabbits were actually a mix of both wild and domestic breeds, the interbreeding of which created a hybrid rabbit that was exceptionally well suited for thriving in the Australian environment. And all of this combined meant that within a decade, the 24 imported rabbits had turned into millions. And the population of rabbits had supposedly gotten so large by the late 60s that 2 million could be shot each year without creating any noticeable difference. Sadly, because of this, the rabbits are suspected of being the biggest known factor in the loss of species in Australia. Many things have been done in an attempt to control their growth, among which include the previously successful method of shooting, as well as poisoning and trapping. However, the most effective large-scale measure was the introduction of the myxoma virus, and I probably don't need to tell you about the effectiveness of a virus. So, in 1950, this myxoma virus was released into the rabbit population, reducing it from an astounding 600 million to just 100 million. Over time, though, genetic resistance to this virus meant the rabbit population recovered quickly and reached between 200 and 300 million by the early 90s. They have since mostly recovered and are still thriving to this day. I'm sorry, Australia, but this means the score is now 2-1 to the animals. And I hate to say it, but there might be another victory for the animals looming in the near future. You see, Australia is now seeing incredible hordes of mice roaming across the eastern part of the country, and new conditions that came as the result of massive droughts followed by floodings have proven ideal for mice to reproduce, and so they've started breeding in the millions. Only the future will tell who's going to win this war, but looking at Australia's track record, my bet is on the mice. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
That seems terrible. Mice. Australia. That's all we got. You guys got a favorite video suggestion, you can subscribe to Patreon or drop it in the comment section. It's your boy D Neal. Out.